When we accept the duality of life, we can't love without loss. We can't be happy without knowing what it's like to be sad, right? We can't grieve without gratitude, all of these different pieces that seem like polar opposites. I think that acceptance and not avoiding it allows us to live more authentically and to know who we are on a deeper level, because we see the whole picture. We see both sides.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. Today on the podcast, I have Dr. Natasha Trujillo. She is a counseling and sports psychologist. She primarily focuses on grief, loss, eating disorders, trauma, and life transitions, and identifying anxiety and depression disorders, perfectionism, and performance psychology. And we will be talking about her new book. And She Was Never the Same Again is the title of her book. And it is a collection of stories of her family's journey through grief and life, and then just how it impacted all the family dynamics. So welcome, Dr. Trujillo, or I'll call you Natasha for the purposes of the podcast.
That sounds
Welcome.
great. Hello, welcome. Thank you for having me.
I am glad you are here. So, Natasha, I like to start off with just sharing a little bit about your upbringing. Where do you currently live and where did you grow up?
Sure. I currently live in Denver, Colorado, and I grew up in Laramie, Wyoming. So my family's kind of up and down I-25. They come from the San Luis Valley down in southern Colorado, but I grew up in Laramie, Wyoming. So I kind of call that whole corridor home.
All of it home, all of it home. And everybody's spread out throughout the United States a bit or mainly stayed in that area. I know your
Mainly
uncle had lived,
stayed.
one of your uncles had lived in California for a while, but I don't know if he's still there, but it's mainly in that area.
Yeah, pretty much all of my immediate family is still in Wyoming. And then I've got a fair amount in Colorado. I've got some in New Mexico and then a couple sprinkled in Nevada and California. But it's primarily Wyoming and Colorado.
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, I want to find out, like, is this your first book? Is this your first book?
It is,
Now,
yes.
what drew you? Of course, you are in this field. You help people in your profession with grief and loss, and there has been a lot in your own family, particularly even you being born is a little miracle in itself, a big miracle in itself. But what drew you to wanting at this moment in time share your story in a book, in a fashion?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I'm actually quite a reserved and private person. So the book is by far the most vulnerable I think I've ever been in my life. And the book came about because I was in a place where I was grieving two very significant, probably the two biggest losses I've ever been through, very close together. And I was struggling, right? I was still functioning, I was still going to work, but was just not doing well. I was not taking care of myself, just couldn't seem to focus, really in that cognitive fog that accompanies grief. And so I kind of thought through like what is going on? What are some of the experiences in my life and in my family's life? Why can't I kind of dig myself out right now? And that's what really started the whole process of writing the book.
So it was a tool for your own healing that drew you to even wanting to write it. Yes?
Yes, and since I specialize in grief and loss, I think there truly was some extra shame, both guilt
Mm.
and shame, because it was like why can't I dig myself out of this? And of course, you know, I would never, the way that I was talking to myself is never, I would never let a patient of mine get away with doing that. Uh, and so that was another piece where it was like, I think I just need to pull, I couldn't intellectualize myself out of it. And so writing for me became this way of, I didn't need to rely on other people. I could still use my own ideas, my own education, my own knowledge, but really weave in the emotions in a way that I felt more comfortable doing than I did speaking to anyone else.
Now, in that process, to be able to gather the information that you used in the book, there, because it's a family, it's a family collective family memoir biography slash grief manual without it being straight, to the point. Like, this is how you should grieve. It is very much like within these stories, you see how each of the characters grieve and how
Yes.
unique it is. So, how was it for you approaching your family in that? If you're more reserved, is that, in general, your family members are also reserved, correct?
For the most part, yeah. We have a few who are a little more open,
Oh.
but yeah, I mean, I asked really difficult questions, and I asked my family members to sit down with me and talk through some of the biggest secrets in the family, some of the most traumatic and devastating experiences they had been through. And that was really challenging. It was palpable. You could almost feel the discomfort, but also the connection when I was sitting in the same room and recording these interviews and asking questions, most of which I think I knew the information at least surface level because I am who I am. So I've always been inquisitive and curious and asking questions and, building deep connections, that sort of thing. But there were definitely pieces that I had absolutely no idea about. And, those were, again, palpable. It was so interesting for me to sit with my own emotions and experiences and make connections and put things together that prior to I hadn't been able to do up to that point.
Now, with those stories and that sharing, did you end up realizing, like, as you're hearing everyone's stories, of the patterns that might have then already been in your family that are like, okay, now that makes so much sense. This is why I am this way, or this is why my dad is this way. This is why my mom was this way, or my brother and my dad's relationship. Like, were those stories like aha moments, or, as you said, it was certain things that you already knew?
For me, there were certain things that I already knew. And again, doing the work of or being a psychologist for several years at this point, I've kind of looked at my family before, right? So, so I kind of came to it with more understanding. But it's also been really interesting to see some of my family's reception to reading the book and to hearing the stories who had no idea. And so it's been really cool. Like, of course, yes, I had some aha moments myself, but it's been really interesting to provide these narratives for my family to have aha moments. Even my younger cousins, I've had a couple younger cousins in the generation after me who have read the book and they're like, yeah, we don't know, we didn't know our great grandma Claire, or we don't really remember Aunt Dora. So, you being able to bring them to life, it makes sense. Who's still living, who reminds them of these women, or that sort of thing. So it was really cool to see some of those aha moments for other
That's
people as well.
Now, since you mentioned your great grandma Claire, let's talk about her, because attending her funeral was the first time you ever went to a funeral. You were 10 years old. You go to her funeral, and there's something within her, because in terms of your family background and your Spanish heritage, she was that person that held this connection to your your Spanish culture. So let go into, first off, your experience as a 10-year-old witnessing being in a funeral for the first time, and then we'll go into this cultural component and secondary losses that came from that.
Sure. Yeah. So I was 10 years old. My great grandfather had died a few years before, but I didn't attend that funeral. And I just didn't, I was younger. I just didn't really get it. And a little back piece here, the stories that I chose to write for the book, I tried to pick events that had the most impact on me. And so my grandma Claire and her chapter is included because that funeral, vivid memories still to this day. And recognizing the changes that my family underwent starting then made this a very impactful and relevant experience to bring to the book. So that's how it made it in. But yeah, I was 10 and I remember so much shock, I think is a great word for it, at seeing the men in my family show any emotion at all. Because in a big Mexican family, there's absolutely that machismo and these roles and expectations about what it means to be a man. And so there was shock in seeing that. There was shock in seeing so many of my aunties and my grandma and some of the women in my family who I typically viewed as very strong and even scary sometimes, frankly, fall apart and show emotion. And I remember walking down the aisle, because the immediate family all kind of ushers in and you're just on display. It is such a bizarre experience. Everyone's turned and staring at you and everyone's crying. And I just remember being like, what are we doing? What is this is so surreal. And so there were so many moments of that where I think I was getting it, right? I knew my grandma had died, and I guess I kind of knew what death meant, but seeing the grief and the sorrow and knowing that no one was really able to take away anybody else's pain, I think I was just overwhelmed with some of the experiences there, and it has stuck with me. And to be frank, it made me quite fascinated with death and dying and culture and how we honor and memorialize our dead. And it contributed to why I specialize in this.
Why you do what you do. Yeah, I believe, was it in that chapter that you talked about the personalization of grief, like how different each person also shows that grief. I don't remember it, but it was the aspect of the explosiveness that some of them take it more the silent aspect. I'm not sure if it was that, but you mentioned right now again, it was the first time you were seeing some of these expressions. So in that part of it being so personal and so unique to the individual, can you touch on that? And then we'll go back again to the other question I had done in my long question about the cultural and secondary losses.
Of course, yes. So that piece of the book is in my Aunt Dora's chapter.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Okay. Thank you.
and that was another piece where, and I probably started that younger in life, but I think I was 20 when my Aunt Dora died, and I was a caretaker for her. I was very involved in her life and in her death. So, again, very impactful in that way. And my Aunt Dora became the matriarch when my grandma Claire died. So, that was kind of the continuation there. Uh, yes, I just make this point, and this is a huge theme throughout the book, is that there is no one way to grieve and we all do it so differently. And so I kind of point out, there are some family members who were angry and explosive and just really struggled to manage their emotions. There were some who became so withdrawn and so isolated and so lonely into themselves. There were some who just cried constantly and wanted to talk about it all the time, right? And so when you're seeing all of these expressions, especially as a child or young adult, and no one's really talking about it, there are still these indirect norms or expectations about what the right way is or what you should or should not be doing. And I just find that fascinating. And that was something I really wanted to highlight because there is no right or wrong. You have to recognize that you have your own needs and how you're going to deal with things, and everyone else's might be a little bit different, but those needs can be competing. And so that can make it tense in a big family when you've got some people who want to do nothing but talk about it, some people who are like, please get away from me, I don't want anything to do with this, and some who are just unapproachable, unreachable in general, right? How do you still become a collective and stay united and work through the collective grief when there's so many individual experiences going on?
As you're saying that, it just even makes me think of the aspect of even love languages, right? Like how each of us has a different way of even showing. love
Yes.
or receiving love in the same way. Grief and how we express it and how we want to process it is so different. And honoring that within the family and even just with your friends, it's just not much different than the fact of how we honor and try to understand how people love and show love and receive love, right? It's similar in that way.
Yes. Yes. And the message I wanted to send, or the way that I wanted to illustrate that, was that all of those expressions are okay. We need to meet people where they are and understand, okay, this is what you need. This is what you're doing. Even if I don't understand it, or maybe I don't even agree with it, I got to give you your space, and you got to give me mine. But somehow we do have to figure out how to connect and come together too, which is obviously much easier said than done.
The way that we grieve and trying to be compassionate towards others and towards ourselves. You even mentioned that even you were being a little even judgmental with yourself and your own most recent grief experiences of like, but I should know how to do this. I should know how to do, I help others doing this. So the compassion, the grace that we have to have with ourselves is not much different than the grace we give others in their grief. And so, yeah, that is very, very valuable. Okay, I don't want to forget because I had asked it before and I don't want to forget. Let's talk about that secondary loss that your family experienced after your great grandma passed away, regarding the cultural part of your heritage, also, quote unquote, dying alongside with her.
Yes, so this is also a big theme in the book that I tried to bring to life. And this is not just for death losses, this is for non death losses as well. But when, often you have your primary loss, right? What is the big thing? So, a death in the family, you lose your job, you retire from sport, whatever that initial loss may be. There are secondary losses, or cumulative losses is another way that we describe it in the literature, which is all these other things that are kind of indirectly and sometimes expected, sometimes not expected, but other ways that we grieve or lose things as a result of that primary loss. So, as it relates to my family and to my culture, and I have noticed this, I think it really started with my great grandma when she died, but it has continued as I've had aunts and uncles die and that sort of thing. My great grandma, she grew up, like I said, down in the San Luis Valley, very strong Mexican family values, right? Spanish was her first language. That area of the country is predominantly Hispanic in nature, so she was not necessarily considered a minority in that part of the country. And so when they moved to Wyoming, the culture and that Mexican heritage, that is what she brought, is what my grandma and her 10 siblings got. And they kept up with the Spanish. Spanish was my grandma's first language as well, and a lot of the cultural traditions. But when she died, I noticed those things stopped. Spanish, she spoke English. It was pretty broken, but she spoke English, so she could speak to, my generation, for example. But I noticed my grandma and her sisters, when I was younger, every breakfast, my grandma babysat us a few days a week, and we'd always go over to one of her sisters' houses. And she's one of 7 girls, 11 kids total. And so it's just Spanish. That's what I heard. And after she died, I wasn't hearing that anymore. And our get togethers, those changed. For holidays, we'd all get together in my grandma Claire's house, or as we got bigger, we'd have to rent a space because there's just so many of us. And those sorts of events became more infrequent, and in some cases today have stopped altogether. And I speak to the secondary losses involved in that. For me, for example, I'm not fluent in Spanish, and that breaks my heart. Some of that culture is gone. Even the family values, or that idea of being together and making sure holidays are a priority, that really has been lost over time. So, like my generation, people and my cousins who have had kids, that sort of thing, their kids have a completely different understanding of family and of cultural values. And I see grief in that. I see loss in that. And when I speak to my older relatives about some of those changes, I see even more grief in them because that was even more ingrained in them than it is in me. And so we see all of these conflicting grief processes that just continue to evolve over time. And I really wanted to bring light to that.
And it's so important to understand that secondary losses can sometimes, or at least for what I've seen and experienced myself, sometimes these secondary losses can kind of suck you in even more than the actual primary loss. And this is
Yes,
just in general, correct? Like there's
yes.
times in which these secondary losses end up inflicting more turmoil within us than the primary loss. Can you give an example in your job, because you see athletes, and I'm curious of how you ended up choosing this type of psychology and in the aspect of grief within that. But let's say somebody that's retiring from the sport and how grief may impact them, and then the secondary. Could you give an example of how that might show up?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book about athletes. I was an athlete, I work primarily with athletes. And one of the biggest examples, I think, to answer your question would be in the sense of retirement. Okay, so that primary loss is going to be your job for the pro, Olympic, Paralympic athletes that I work with, or even college athletes. When they retire, the main loss is the game, the sport, whatever it is they do. An example of a secondary piece is the communities that they are a part of. That transition can be super challenging for college athletes who always have meals taken care of. Travel is coordinated for them. They know exactly what they need to eat. They know exactly when and what they need to do for their exercise. When you retire, no one's doing any of that for you anymore. So there are losses in your schedule. What do you do with your free time? How do you manage some of those things? Identity, that's another example of a secondary loss. A lot of athletes, particularly at that elite level, their sport is the main part of their identity, for better or worse. And sometimes their worth is connected to their achievement in their sport. And so when they retire, their identity undergoes significant loss because it's like, who am I without the sport? What else do I even like to do? When you're spending all of your time being poured into training for your sport, you don't even know what you like to do. And that was something I tried to highlight in my own experience the chapter focuses on my experience as an athlete. But that was a huge piece for me. I had no idea what I liked to do because I never had free time prior to retiring from basketball. So when I stopped, it was like I just don't know, and other people don't know either. So you also have losses from a relationship perspective. People didn't know what to ask me about for my whole life. They had been like, "Hi, how's school? How's basketball?" And you could see them almost trip over their words where they were like, "How's bat?" And they'd back up. But they were like, "Yeah, we don't know what else to ask you about." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't either because this is my identity. So I guess I better find some new hobbies."
That's so identity is such a big one. I realized that the first time like I really like grasped on the grief regarding identity, and at least for me, was when I became a mom, of
Yeah.
me really missing and like not like I was really sad, and it was not postpartum. It was this aspect of this like, where am I? I was really still searching for the parts of me that I could not see now as this role of mother. I was grieving her and
Yes.
grieving the
Yes.
part of me that was before, and then having to try to find ways of incorporating that slightly into my current life. But
Yes.
it draws then the question of like, really, then when you're going through these questions for ourselves or even with your patients, then how do you dig deeper into really who are we without the labels that supposedly define us, or we think define us, and that society and our family define us, so that when these labels are no longer there, whether it is from grief, let's say somebody loses a spouse, they're a widow, They're a widow, right? So they're no longer uh, with someone, right? So
Yes.
that's a identity part. So can you talk about that? Like, how do we? Is there a way that we can kind of either do journaling or something to really dig deeper into who are we without the titles?
So great. Yeah. Two thoughts come to mind. One is the importance of values, right? So what is actually important to you and what provides a sense of a meaningful life, a purposeful life, a wholehearted life. So I think that's one direction that I often go when I'm working with people clinically. I also think you said something that made me think of another big theme in the book, which is looking at every life event, whether it's desirable or undesirable, from a gains and losses perspective. Because I think when we accept the duality in life, so I guess this is another answer to your question, this idea of acceptance. When we accept the duality of life, we can't love without loss. We can't be happy without knowing what it's like to be sad, right? We can't grieve without gratitude, all of these different pieces that seem like polar opposites. I think that acceptance and not avoiding it allows us to live more authentically and to know who we are on a deeper level because we see the whole picture. We see both sides. So your point is so beautiful as far as becoming a mom. I actually talk about this a lot with my own patients because many who are new moms are terrified. There's so much social constraint to talk to other people and say, actually, this is hard and I am losing things. And there's part of me that misses my life before. And I'm not saying I don't want my child, but this is really hard and I'm grieving certain things. And so that is a space with me where my clients can really open up and dig into that and talk about that. And it just speaks to, for the most part, having a baby is a very desirable event under most circumstances. But there are still undesirable outcomes. There is still grief and loss. And on the flip side, even the most undesirable events, a career ending injury as an athlete, a death in the family, losing your job, even outside the athletic sphere, things like that, there are still things to be gained and ways that you grow. Maybe not right away. And I wouldn't bring that up to someone right in the throes of a loss.
Completely agree. I completely agree. You don't say, well, at least.
uh,
No.
at least, and still, right? Those
Yeah,
two
yeah.
words are like bad words when it comes to grief. But yeah, over time, we see these ways in which growth and improvement and change and perspective benefit our life.
Agreed completely. Hence the title of my podcast,
Yes.
because it is that. It really does. And it is not to take away, as we said, from that moment. Just like we were saying, that comparison of me becoming a mom, grieving who I was, did not take away the fact that I loved it. The same thing goes. You're grieving, you can still be grateful for certain things in your life without it meaning that you are, not it's not like that toxic positivity or whatever thing of, that's not what it is about. It's you're wanting to hold these emotions and feelings in the same space as well.
Yes. Yeah, it's a both and
Yeah.
instead of an either or. And that was a huge reason why I wanted the book title to include the word and. That is
Mm.
symbolic to me. That really speaks to, you have this loss and there will be gains, there will be losses, and that is just so important. And that's a clinical idea that I use with my own clients all the time.
Now let's talk about the stigma we of grief, and talking about grief as well as death or difficulties or what. And because we even just you mentioned how when some of your clients may come with this turmoil of whatever it is they're feeling, that they don't feel they can share then with others. Can you focus a little on that?
Yes. Another huge reason why I wanted to write the book is to help people understand that, of course, we grieve death losses, but we grieve so many other things. Anytime we lose something important or of significance to us, there's also a grief process there. And so that was something I really wanted to draw out and make quite clear. So regardless of the topic, that was it is something that I wanted to come back to and give people perspective. And so when I'm working clinically, for example, uh, I specialize in eating disorders, I specialize in trauma, so and performance psychology, working with those sorts of issues when setbacks occur or when challenges occur. I'm thinking about injuries or you lose a big game, right? We're getting ready for the Olympics right now. I have several athletes that I work with getting ready to do their trials, coming up soon. Not all of them are going to leave victorious. And so when I'm working with them, I will bring up grief. I will bring up this concept, I will name it, and I get really interesting reactions. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, that's too strong. I don't think I'm grieving because nobody died, right? That seems too much." Or I'll have people where you can see the weight fall off their shoulders where it's like, "Yes, that is it." And so to the point with stigma, I think there's so many expectations and false definitions of what we can grieve and what we can't grieve. But I have found it's just so powerful to bring it up and name it and call it what it is because it gives people this better foundation to understand what they are going through and to look at it through that sort of lens. So I think that in and of itself is a strategy to kind of break through that stigma. From a death perspective, I think we live in a very death anxious culture, right? I find it so fascinating that when we're really tired, we can say, "Oh, I'm so dead." But when somebody dies, we say we lost them or they passed away. And I'm like,
Yeah.
right.
Uh-huh.
So there's a lot of death anxiety going on. And I think that furthers some of the stigma. People don't know what to say, they don't know how to be helpful, which is another huge theme I bring into the book is that you don't have to know what to say. There is no right thing to say. There is no one thing that's going to take somebody's pain away in that moment. It's really about being with them and being alongside them rather than doing something for them. Because with really significant loss, it's not going to go away. Nothing you
Mhm.
do is going to make it go away. Sure, it might be helpful if you bring over dinner or run an errand or that sort of thing, but it is not going to alleviate that suffering for that person. And
There's
that's not
nothing
the
to
goal.
fix. Yeah, there's nothing to
Yes.
fix. There's right?
Yes.
And this we live in a society in general that we are trying to fix, especially when things make us uncomfortable. We want
Yes.
to fix them because they make us like feel unsettled. So when someone comes and they tell you things to try to make you feel better or fix how you're feeling, it isn't really about you and them. They're trying to kind of alleviate their own anxiety that your expression of grief and your, sadness is creating in them.
Yes. Well, and I think that's part of the stigma, right? Is that this
Hmm.
grief is some problem that needs to be taken away or fixed, right? As you said, or solved. And it's like, no, it's very natural and normal and appropriate. And yes, it's uncomfortable and conflicted and messy, but it is life.
And yeah, and life is complex. So let's go back again into your book. So you told us why it is you started then to write it. You then went into this history. Your own birth was a miracle. Your mom almost lost you, correct? Lost you. They
She
still
almost
here as
died. Well,
she
both,
almost
I
died.
guess.
Yes, both. Yeah.
She almost died, and then a
You,
couple years later, I almost died.
yes. Oh, that's right. Oh, there it is. That's my part. So because her own first experience of pregnancy then with you was the second, right? Is that correct? She had the hemorrhage was the first
So
pregnancy, is that correct?
she had a miscarriage before me, and then she
Yes.
hemorrhaged after she had me, and then I had a flight for life when I was 2.5.
When you and those were all, so how even carrying you was had this grief within it, which I could relate with that aspect with her because my first pregnancy was a miscarriage. And so then the anxiety then in pregnancy throughout my second and then my
Yes.
third pregnancy was there. So when we talk about how things even shape our, current life experience, like in your case, for your mom's case, for you, we don't know what people are bringing into their present that comes from their past and how affects that, the future. Can you talk a little more about that? And it doesn't have to be particular with your mom, but then this idea of understanding these human interactions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought these dynamics were so important to bring into the book. I've always seen my mom as a fairly anxious soul. I love her dearly, but she worries so much and it's all the time. And I feel like it's quite unnecessary most of the time. And again, there were some pieces of this that I knew prior to, and some that I didn't. So, yeah, my mom's journey has not been easy. And so growing up, just getting so frustrated, she always wanted to know where I was, and right, just so involved, which now I'm thankful for. But at the time, as a teenager, I was like, just get away from me. I'm fine. But now understanding that context, it was so important, right? And even though I was alive for her hemorrhage, but I was 2 weeks old. I don't remember anything from that. It was a terribly traumatic event. My mom was 20 years old. My dad was 21. She almost lost her life. My dad thought she was dead, right? She lost more than 50% of the blood in her body. And then just 2 years later, I was born healthy, fine, but had a flight for life, was in full respiratory failure. The doctors came in and told my parents that I was not going to live. My mom was 6 months pregnant at the time of my flight for life. And my brother, we didn't know this at the time, but she was pregnant with twins. When she delivered my brother, there were two placentas, but one child. So we think she even miscarried there. So when you think about all of the grief and all of the loss and all of the anxiety, of course that's worry. Those are terrifying experiences. She's 20, 23 years old when these things happen. That's going to breed a fierce level of protectiveness and of worry, right? Death anxiety. She was so concerned about something happening to our family. So as a teenager and even as an adult, even now sometimes I'm like, Mom, you gotta give me some space here. But I needed to understand that background for her because it makes me cope with some of that a little bit better, understanding, yes, this is why she is the way she is. That doesn't mean she can't work on it. Which of course, I throw in as much as I can to her, but it's just so imperative to understand, like, yeah, I get it. And it allows me to give her more grace and for our relationship it's better. It's better as a result of that.
And it's interesting because even then aspects of sometimes our personality can be affected by the upbringing that we have. So the tendency of
Yes.
perfectionism, for example, right? Or certain things of outcome that you might have in certain parts of your life and that you had within yourself could have been kind of triggered per se because of your upbringing as well.
Sure, sure. Well, and I speak to that even in my parents as well. Those events that my parents went through as very young newlyweds, truly children themselves, right? They were married at 18 and 19, had me at 20. Uh, the way that my mom has become more anxious, that really is part of her personality. She worries a lot. And my dad kind of became this protective, I have to produce, I have to provide, because we got a lot of medical expenses.
Mhm.
There's a lot. And so you can see that work ethic and that I always have to do more and make sure we have this extra layer of protection. You can see even how they show up today, where that sort of came from. And in myself, I don't know that I could articulate this as a kid, but I obviously knew that my mom worried a lot, and I knew that my dad worked a lot, and I was fine. I wanted to make sure they knew that I was fine and they didn't need to worry, or I could take care of myself and that sort of thing. So I don't think I was putting that together as a child, but I think I was very much developing those skills that very much stick with me today. I'm fiercely independent. I'm fine is probably the way I answer most questions, even when that's not the case. So it was very helpful for me and for, yes, my own perfectionism and sense of control and
Mhm.
that sort of thing. Yeah, it's all connected.
And it's not to like try to like put blame on anything when these things show up that we know we are. It's just to try to understand. Because again, even just our own actions, as even just myself as a parent, are going to have an impact on my kids. But even the most perfect parenting aspects, even if your parents would have been like the perfect, would have still created some issues for
Yes.
you to work on later
Yes.
on, right?
Oh, 100%. That was also something I tried to make so clear in the book. I am so grateful for my parents. I am very lucky. I am very privileged in a lot of ways, but they too have this balance. Kind of comes back to the duality. Like I
Hmm.
said earlier, there are some beautiful, attractive, appealing, and admirable parts of each of them. And there are also some parts that are more difficult to digest and really hard to be around and work with at times. And I have that myself, right? We all have that. But that's a point or a consideration that I really want readers to take away is I want you to be able to look at the people in your lives a little bit more balanced and accept and sit with it's both and. You're not going to have either or. No one is all bad or all good. And recognizing that that's a spectrum, like I said, I think can really just help us cope more effectively and hopefully build more compassion and more grace and connection into the relationships that we have.
And, even just their own personalities also made you bond very much with your grandma pride as well, than just these other dynamics and relationships. And I know she's passed away most recently, uh, correct? Recently in the last
2020. Yeah.
2020. And that in itself, that's in the chapter of just how that also created a huge impact in your life as well. So, but again, without your own dynamics with your parents, who knows how your relationship with her would have been, whether it would have been that strong bond that you had. So all of this is all so intertwined. Human relationships are complex, and when you add grief to it and all of the other things and your own personalities, it is, yeah, it's a
Yes.
myriad of options.
Yes, and the culture and the expectations. I think growing up, I thought this was normal, but as I've gotten older, I don't think this is normal. I think my childhood is quite unique in that before my parents even had my brother and I, they sat down with both sets of their parents and said, "Hey, we're going to have kids. You know, we want you guys to babysit them." So I was very lucky in that my grandmas had my brother and I for our whole childhood, right? My mom's mom had us 3 days a week. My dad's mom had us 2 days a week. And so that getting to be with both families truly all of the time was so, I had no idea how privileged I was to have that sort of experience. And I think there's a lot of cultural family values, right, that play a role in how that came to be that have, of course, informed how I show up and some of the values that I have. And that allowed for me to be as close with both of my grandmas as I was and am.
Thank you. Now, as we're wrapping up, I want to ask you a couple questions. First one, what are some tools that you see are helpful for your clients and that you've seen have been helpful even for you in processing grief and navigating grief and mourning?
Yes. I think one of the biggest things I would like to leave listeners with is that there is no right way to do it. So trying to suspend expectations and give yourself compassion and just meet yourself where you are is really, really important. Understanding that it is not a linear process. It is very messy and conflicted and confusing. I think that is really helpful because what I often find is there's so much self criticism and judgment and evaluation that people will share with me, right? When I'm working with someone because they aren't aware, right? They're expecting grief to go a certain way or they want it to follow the certain timeline. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces is just kind of suspending some of the notions around what you should or should not be doing. I think another big piece, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but the acceptance piece and kind of sitting with the both and that duality, I think those interventions are really, really important. Thinking through the gains and losses of different events, I think those are really, really important. And along with that, acceptance is recognizing, and again, this so directly ties into the title. That's why I wrote the book called And She Was Never the Same Again, to really illustrate that idea that after significant loss, we are not going to return to our former self. That is not the goal. And that's okay that that's not the goal. We will be forever changed. So I think that's a big piece. Finding community and support is really important. How open do you feel you can be? How vulnerable do you feel you can be? Right? Find communities, find ways to express yourself, even creatively. I mean, I wrote a book, right? But there's so many grief artists out there, or think about the music, that we listen to. There's so many grief themes in music. So, whatever that expressive form is for yourself, try to find those ways to express yourself both individually and collectively with support. I think that balance too is really important. We didn't talk too much about balance and flexibility, but I think those are key components in grief. Sometimes we need to be alone. Sometimes we need people. Sometimes we need to ask for people to come be in our space. Sometimes we need to tell people to
Mm.
leave our space. Give yourself that flexibility and allow for that balance. Again, there is no right or wrong. You just kind of have to honor what you need and surround yourself with people who can honor that, even if they don't agree or even if they don't like it.
That is so perfect because it is that it's encompassing all these different things and then finding the ways to kind of channel these different ways that are helpful in your grief journey, whether again like you said expressing it, whether it's talking to just one person, whether it's going to a grief group, whether it's going to a therapist, whether it's going to a grief coach, whether it's just expressing it in dance or a book, like you said, some way of kind of taking it, from you out, out
Yes.
of
Yes.
out.
Yeah. And I think I'll also leave people with this idea that grief does not go away, but it does change shape over time. It takes up different space around us. And I think that piece is really important because at the end of the day, the only way to cope with grief is to be with it and go through it. You can't avoid it. You can't do your way out of it. It is always going to find its way, right? Out into the open space in one way or another. So, again, I think accepting that and acknowledging that and figuring out how to move forward with that is another coping mechanism, which isn't just one skill. That's a huge process, but something that I would leave for people to consider.
Perfect. Now, is there anything I have not asked you that you want to make sure to also add here to share with the audience?
Ooh, good question. Wow, we've talked about a lot of things. I don't I don't think so. We've
We
done a
went
good
into different.
job.
Perfect. It's probably the first time I'm like, wait, you don't have any. Perfect. Now, what about your book? Let's share with the audience how they can get your book, where it's available. And She Was Never the Same Again. How can they access it? And I'll make sure to include the show in the show notes.
Yes, so a couple ways you can access it: Amazon, and then locally here in Denver, I'm working on getting it into a couple places. My hometown in Wyoming has it. And then you could also get it through my website, npttherapy.com, or the book website, and she was never the same again.com.
Perfect. So I am just so grateful again for you being on the show, Dr. Natasha Trujillo, again, author of And She Was Never the Same Again. And you can, if you're an athlete, make sure to reach her through her website also, not just for her story, but for her services. And
Yes.
mainly athletes, correct? Mainly athletes?
Athletes and performers, yes, both current and former. And although I live in Denver, I'm licensed in like 40 states throughout the country. So I work
40.
all
I'm
over.
sure there's
So
definitely, yeah. So if you're
yes,
in the United States, you're most likely able to be.
most likely, yes, yes. And I would also say I do work with some just high performance professionals as well, business executives, lawyers, doctors, that sort of thing too. People who are perfectionists, have a very hard time relaxing, slowing down, have a hard time being very good at doing, but have a hard time being. So,
Oh, I like that. Yes, that is probably a lot of us.
yes, yes, it is. I'm very busy.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Natasha, for being on the show. Again, this was Dr. Natasha Trujillo, author of And She Was Never the Same Again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.